It is my great honor to welcome Mr. Kumiharu Shigehara. He is President, International Economic Policy Studies Association, also former Deputy Secretary General of OECD. Please welcome Mr. Shigehara.
皆さん、こんばんは。だいぶ日の暮れが早くなってまいりました。Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour à toutes et tous qui participent à cette conférence en ligne depuis la France. Et bonsoir à ceux qui sont présents ici à Tokyo. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'll speak in English for the convenience of non-Japanese-speaking participants. The title of today's conference is Visions for 2050. In other words, the 3 decades to come. In discussing this topic, let us first recall the main features of economic performance of major players in the global scene over the past 3 decades. During most of this period, high economic growth has been the dominant goal of economic policy and the principal measure of an economy's success. Back in 1997, Paul Samuelson, a distinguished American economist and Nobel Prize laureate, wrote an article titled, For Japan, a Message of Optimism. He first commented on the poor performance of the Japanese economy after the burst of its bubble in the early part of the 1990s. Then he went on to write, Japan worker will still have the work ethic. Skills have not been rusted away, and class warfare and trade union bad feeling have not been spawned by the long stagnating economy. Once its wheel of commerce again started a normal trend, Japan will probably astound the world and itself by a catch-up and acceleration in Japanese production. This Samuelson proved it right in this observation about Japan. Shortly after his article was published, Japan was hit by the Asian financial crisis, and it severely curtailed Japan's export to the region. In the second half of the 20s, the US housing market debacle led to the global financial crisis and economic crisis as well, and due largely to the mismanagement of Japanese monetary policy to cope with it. Japan's economic performance was more hesitant than in the United States. As a result, real GDP, gross domestic product per capita in Japan, which stood at 85% of the US level in 1990, declined to 76% of the US level in 2000, and 73% of its level in 2010. Despite some recovery of the Japanese economy, achieved largely as a result of aggressive monetary policy easing under the government of Shinzo Abe, who started his second term as the Prime Minister of Japan in December 2012, Japan's GDP per capita stood at 70% of the US level in 2019, the year before the COVID-19 hit the world economy. In a nutshell, Paul Samuelson's note of optimism proved to be wrong. Rather than Japan catching up to the US level of material living standards in terms of this economic outmeasure, the GDP gap between the two countries widened significantly over the past 3 decades. Economic growth performance in several high-income countries in Europe over the past 3 decades have been not satisfactory either. For example, GDP per capita in Germany, the largest European market economy and industrial power, declined from 87% of the US level in 1990 to 82% of its level in 2019. France's real GDP per capita declined from 81% of the US level in 1990 to 71% of its level in 2019, virtually the same level as Japan level in that year. And in Italy, a country devastated severely by the euro area crisis that started in late 2009, real GDP per capita declined from 86% of the US level in 1990 to 64% of its level in 2019. That said, real GDP per capita alone is not enough for the international comparison of living standards across countries. This measure does not fully reflect the adverse effects of human well-being of the interaction between economic output, activity, and environmental and other factors. In fact, according to the 2021 version of the OECD report, Going for Growth, greenhouse carbon GHG emissions per capita in the United States have remained far above the OECD average in recent years, while those in Germany have been on par with the OECD average. Over the same period, GHG emissions per capita in Japan have not decreased, though they have been somewhat below the OECD average, while they have continued to decline below the OECD average in France. I would add that in Sweden, where the environmental policies have been actively used, GHG emission per capita continue to decline and to reach a level with less than half of the Germany, while real GDP per capita have been on par with that in Germany. I would also add that fortunately, a very low share of population in the United States is exposed to the harmful effect of air pollution, whereas 3/4 of populations in Japan, Germany, and Italy, and 2/3 of population in France have been exposed to such adverse effects. The rise of China was a topic Paul Samuelson discussed also in his 1997 article. He wrote, "Now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, it is mainland China that is occupying people's mind. We read headlines about more than 10% growth rates in mainland China. However, China's level of per capita living is only about 1/6 that of Japan. It will be a long time until China's entire civilian population comes anywhere near its military might. And then, by some luck, China will have evolved into a stable multi-party democracy." Well, China's level of real GDP per capita rose to about 24% of Japan's level in 2010 and 38% of Japan's level in 2019. While this is a remarkable achievement, Samuelson was right to say that it will take a long time in China's entire population enjoy high living standards. Moreover, GHG emissions per capita in China have been on a rising trend. They were 2.7% higher than the level in 2000, and Samuelson's hope for China evolving into a stable multi-party democracy has remained far from reality. Looking ahead, raising GDP per capita in China to the OECD average level without entailing significant further increases in GHC emission per capita would be far more difficult than raising per capita living standards in Japan and EU economies toward the US level, while aiming at the same time to hit near zero carbon emissions and high global warming, limit the high global warming to a safe 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, in line with the Paris Agreement adopted by 196 parties in COP21 in Paris. Both real GDP per capita and GHC emissions per capita have been on a rising trend in India as well. India has a much further way to go to reach living standards and environmental quality existing in developed economies. India is expected to overtake China as the most populous country by the year 2025. Both of them are crucial partners in determining the future course of the planet. It is in the most impoverished regions of the world, including much of Africa and Latin America, the greenhouse gas emissions have been generated primarily for the production of commodities distributed to developed countries. These regions often lack electrical installations, transportation, schools, healthcare, housing, and the basic social services. They are in desperate need for economic development. It is in this context that David Klein, professor of mathematics at California State University, argued that global sustainability and basic principles of justice called for selective deindustrialization, especially in the dominant capitalist centers, combined with sustainable industrialization focused most intensively in the parts of the world that have been the brunt of imperialism. He noted that to save the planet, we must discard imperialism and develop a better alternative through democratic cooperation. Our survival depends on implementing social system that meets our actual needs, is sustainable, and respect nature. In a seminal paper, Capitalism and Ecology, the Nature of the Contradiction, John Foster, an American sociologist, noted that capitalism's internal laws of motion extend out to phenomena that are usually conceived as external to the system. And he argued that we'll have to turn to Karl Marx in discussing two crucial topics. That is, first, must ecological crisis lead to economic crisis under capitalism? And second, to what extent is there an ecological contradiction at the heart of a capitalist society? As one of the key elements in his ecological analysis, Marx employed the concept of a rift in the metabolic relation between human beings and the earth. Marx focused on the extreme separation of town and country under capitalism, which grew out of the separation of the mass of the population from the soil. Marx recognized that this metabolic rift represented a problem of sustainability and remarked that capitalism sapped the vitality of the everlasting sources of wealth, the soil and the worker. He developed an account of sustainability the conservation, if need be, restoration of the earth so that it could be passed on in an equal or even improved state to the succeeding chain of human generations. Marx captured the essence of the contemporary notion of sustainable development, emphasizing the need to maintain the earth for successive generations and directly addressing such issues as soil, nutrient recycling, population, sanitary conditions, deforestation, food desertification, climate change, recycling of industrial waste, diversity of species, and other issues. Is capitalism that currently governs both corporate and national interests capable of shifting its focus to short-term profit maximization to an environmentally sustainable system? Radical action is called for by the activist, but it would run the risk of maintaining and remaining costly, often alienating large segment of the population, along with corporate and national interest groups at a time when we are racing against the clock to avoid an environmental emergency. Indeed, Johann Rockström, one of the world's most influential earth scientists, recently argued that activism is a necessary force for change, but it can be counterproductive if the indifferent majority thinks everything to do with the environment is about barricades and breaking down the world order and alternative lifestyle that doesn't attract the mainstream. We need all forces. Town tree huggers, frontier activists are very important, but they can't tip the whole thing over by themselves. We also need the bankers and executives. Why? Because we have only 10 years to cut emissions by half. We can't change the economic model in 10 years. We can't forbid everyone to do things in 10 years. We can't re-educate population in that time. We must be very tactical. In 2020, the OECD published a report, Beyond Growth Toward a New Economic Approach, which is prepared by an advisory group composed of experts drawn from diverse area of activities. As regards the objectives of economic policy, it urges a move away from a traditional emphasis on GDP growth to a multi-dimensional conception of economic progress, comprising environmental sustainability, rising human well-being, and falling inequality and system resilience. The prioritization of efficiency objectives may have undermined the resilience of societies by overlooking equity and sustainability objectives. The emergence of COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated previous trends with clear systematic problems among the different income groups. Embracing a multi-dimensional set of objectives as advocated by this group and promoted by the OECD would enable assessment of trade-offs and complementarities, as well as identification of unintended consequences to better guide policy choices and decision-making. Earlier this year, the OECD published a new report, The Inequalities, Environmental Nexus Towards a People-Centered Green Transition. It suggests an integrated policy to be structured in 4 pillars, including measures designed to, first, mitigate the possible regressive impact of pricing environmental externalities for vulnerable households. Second, achieve green growth with investment in human capital through active labor market policies, well-targeted income support measures, and upgrading skills to facilitate labor reallocation. Third, address systemic inequalities with sectoral and place-based policy that facilitates social dialogue, social capital investment, social protection, skills, and education investment to ease structural adjustment of local economies. And fourth, ensure efficient and responsive governance to manage green transition. I strongly support these recommendations from the OECD, and at the same time, I want to stress that all of us must realize we are in a race against the clock to avoid an environmental emergency. We must digest the transformation of economies and our own behavior that is implied by the existential fight against climate change, even as a report published in August this year from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change laid bare how little time we have left to accelerate the transition to a cleaner world. Thank you for your attention. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention. ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Mr. Shigehara. The point is well taken that activists are necessary to raise awareness, but they alone cannot achieve and confront the challenge that we all face. We must all in it together, government and private sector.